First, let me say the title is What Should a Radiation Regulator Do About Norm? I'm going to talk about what FANA is doing and thinking about certain parts of norm, unsurprisingly in the oil and gas industry. But I hope that will shed some light on the general issues we've been discussing. Some of what I shall say is settled already by FANA's decisions and by the UAE nuclear law. Some of it represents our current thinking about where to go in regulation and norm. And I hope it'll be possible to tell the difference between the two sides. It won't surprise you to know that the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is a fairly significant organisation in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. It's very important. So when Mr. Bakhit comes and asks questions of FANA, they're very important to answer properly. And he's asked two questions at different times. First of all, a simple, very broad question, does FANA regulate norm? And the answer we gave then was, well, no, but perhaps the answer really was, well, not yet. And then he asked a question later, does our proposal for a norm treatment and disposal facility require a licence from FANA under the nuclear law? And the answer was yes. And he looked a little puzzled. And I think the part of this presentation is to try and ease his puzzlement and to explain why we gave two different answers and whether we should have given two different answers. Now, taking oil and gas out of the ground certainly may create, or usually does create, an exposure situation. You alter a pathway and you end up with exposure of people, usually mostly workers, to radiation. The practice, I think, is well justified, certainly in Abu Dhabi. But is it an existing exposure situation or a planned exposure situation? We've been thinking about that a lot and talking about it during this session. But why does that matter? Well, as Don and others have said, a planned exposure situation is meat and drink to a regulator. They usually can be and usually should be regulated. And regulation means several things. It means the activity requires authorization, usually licensing, after review and assessment of plans and arrangements that are set out in an application. It requires assessment against requirements, regulations, and then it's subject to inspection and enforcement. So regulation is not something to be entered into lightly. It's quite an extensive process and quite an expensive process. And all is to ensure the optimization of protection and safety and the application of individual dose limits. An existing exposure situation, as we've been talking about, it really does require a more graded approach and be the subject of guidance rather than full-blown regulation, in my view. And I think there's a difficulty if regulators go in with the full-blown, the full box and dice of authorization, review and assessment, regulation and inspection and enforcement in these circumstances. Let me take a step sideways a little bit and talk about FANA's regulatory system, which is made under the federal law by Decree number 6 of 2009, which you see pictured there in an unofficial translation. And it says that anyone who wishes to undertake a regulated activity using regulated material must have a license from FANA to do so. Regulated activity for radioactive materials includes things that are given the glorious generic names of possession, use, handling, manufacture. Then there's import and export, transportation, storage and disposal. So doing stuff with regulated material constitutes something that needs a license. Now, what is regulated material? There's a lot of stuff that we've defined in the law as including regulated. But it does include radioactive materials in bulk quantities where the activity concentration of any radionuclide in the uranium-thorium series exceeds 1 becquerel per gram. So it does capture, potentially, norms as regulated material. So if you're carrying out regulated activity with regulated material, you require a license from FANA. I'll just touch on exemption as a process. You require a license to do regulated activity with regulated material, but you may be able to be exempted from those requirements. And first of all, there's the dose criterion, the 10 microsieverts criterion that's well established and well standarded throughout the world, following on the IAEA basic safety standards. But then we have a catch-all provision that says, well, you can be exempted if protection is already optimised, and basically regulation wouldn't improve that optimisation. And we drew that from, well, the law draws that from the IAEA basic safety standards. Quite what it means, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure I would accept an application from ENEC, the operator of the nuclear plant, saying their protection and safety is already optimised, and any regulation won't help that. But there must be some meaning in this context, and we'll explore that a little more, perhaps. Certainly the notion of conditional exemption is implied a little bit in that definition, I think. So I think it is clear enough that from this statement of FANA's regulatory fundamentals, the carrying out of regulated activity, the activity of gathering material containing norm residues above 1 becquerel per gram, processing it, and disposing of the conditioned norm residues is a planned exposure situation. It involves regulated activity, possession, transport, storage, disposal with regulated material. So I think the answer to question 2 is right. It is yes. It is a regulated activity with regulated material, and ADNOC requires a license from it. It requires justification of the activity. Is it better than doing nothing? Probably yes. Therefore, FANA has decided that it needs to regulate the proposed norm facility, and ADNOC has applied for a license, and we're under review and assessment of that application. So that's the easy part, the answer to question 2. Harder is the answer to question 1. So, okay, then for the deliberate and planned handling of norm residues, we've decided that's a regulated activity with regulated material. But is the activity of just oil and gas production itself likely to be an existing exposure situation? And more subject to guidance than regulation. And the question is anything gained by a licensing process? I'd be surprised if ADNOC were amenable to a situation in which they wanted to open a new field and drill a new well, and they had to get a license from FANA in order to do so. I think they'd find that surprising, and so would I. So does oil and gas production involve regulated activity, possession, use, handling of regulated materials? Arguably, no, because the exposure is incidental to the purpose of oil and gas production. They're not actually doing it in order to handle regulated material. They're not undertaking the regulated activity in order to improve people's lives by the use of regulated material. So arguably, it's not a regulated activity. Certainly some post-production activities, as we've said, the gathering of material and perhaps the decommissioning of facilities may be things that are regulated activities. But I think there's an argument to say that it's not a regulated activity with regulated material to produce oil and gas. Let's take another step aside and think of the example of Aircrew. And apart from the situation of radon, which I'll have more to say about, exposure of aircrew to cosmic radiation is the most studied occupational existing exposure situation. ICRP, what have I said there, 107? It should be 103, shouldn't it? It says it's existing exposure situation, as does the IAEA BSS. And I quote that at some length there because I think it's an interesting way of dealing with the exposure of aircrew. The regulatory body or other relevant authority shall determine whether the assessment of exposure of aircrew is warranted. Is it worth doing at all? Where assessment is deemed warranted, the regulatory body or other relevant authority shall establish a framework which shall include a reference level of dose and a dose assessment and recording methodology. Employers where doses are likely to exceed the reference level shall assess doses, keep records and make available records to aircrew and apply requirements for pregnant aircrew. I probably misquote the European Union BSS there, but I'm grateful to hear that it is a planned exposure situation under the BSS. In the draft, it talked about what I thought was a de facto reference level of 6 millisieverts per annum applied to it. It sounded like they were having in Australian parlance, a kind of bob each way between an existing exposure situation and a planned exposure situation. So are oil and gas production workers anything like aircrew? I think the picture shows one difference in that the workforce on oil and gas production is likely to be somewhat gender balanced in the other direction from at least the cabin crew of aircrew. But there are similarities. They work for an entirely non-radiation purpose, which brings them into a situation of exposure to higher levels of naturally occurring radiation. Both are industries with a strong safety culture. That can work for you in radiation protection. It could work possibly against you because their safety culture is directed towards very important and very direct issues of safety on an oil rig or in an aircraft, whereas exposure to naturally occurring radioactive material is well down on the list of hazards. However, the exposures in oil and gas production are likely to be more variable from field to field and are more difficult to estimate. You can plug into a piece of software and get the exposure arising from a Sydney to Abu Dhabi flight, and putting aside polar flights and the sunspot cycle, you can do it pretty much mechanically. But in both cases, measurements and generic behaviour modelling can allow you, or in oil and gas production, you can characterise the fields. They're known fairly well, and the activities are of course well known, and you can produce a kind of generic way of estimating dose likely to arise. Not as precisely as you can in the exposure of aircrew, but nonetheless it can be done. So a possible radiation regulatory approach for oil and gas production, that is the answer to question one. It's a complicated answer, but it extends the analogy to aircrew. Perhaps the regulatory body, after consulting the industry, should establish a reference level and a methodology for dose assessment. Then we should invent a process for giving a conditional exemption from regulatory control, granted on the conditions, those conditions there, that the operator makes a dose assessment using the recommended methodology and derived from measurements of activity concentration in the local conditions. If the assessed doses fall significantly below the reference level, there's no need for further action. if the assessed doses are above or near the reference level, a scheme for individual worker dose assessment should be implemented and assessed doses recorded. Pregnancy information and management as for Aircrew. And otherwise, we assume that prudent occupational health and safety management achieves optimisation in these circumstances. Now, this is a proposal, a thought that we are having. We want to discuss it, obviously, with the stakeholders to see whether it's doable or whether it's sensible, and take it further. But I think the analogy with Aircrew, I think, is an important and useful one. One of the instructions here was to say, how can ICRP help? Well, I think more analysis and exploration of existing exposure situation, it would be good. Currently, you tend to get a few brief paragraphs on existing exposure situations and you bang on about radon for hours. I think it's about time to declare victory and leave radon, but that's my personal view. And why we worry about space crew, I'm not too sure, but obviously people ask and are prepared to listen to the answers. So, reference levels, I think, need more development. What exactly are they? How do you set a reference level? If I follow this path that I've laid out for an oil and gas industry, what reference level should I choose? Should I try and get the average exposure of a worker in oil and gas throughout the world and say, well, that's about right for the reference level? Or do I double it? Or do I take the 1 to 20 millisievert range and say, well, 10's in the middle, so that's about right? How do I go about setting a reference level? And then what do I mean by saying I have to optimise protection and safety under that reference level? I think there's a few interesting developments that need to come further in thinking about these issues. So I think there should be more work on thinking of the difference between industries in setting reference levels and how they can be applied. So finally, by advocating flexibility supported by principles, I think is what the role of ICRP can be in further norm discussion. Shukran, thank you.